Okay, we're going to be covering the connective tissues, but before we get into covering the connective tissues, I wanted to show you this tissue chart. This tissue chart organizes our tissues into big tissue categories, subcategories. It gives the specific tissue names and the structures you're responsible for knowing for your practical number 2. So here we will see that epithelial tissues is one of our big tissue categories. Connective tissues is another big tissue category. Our muscle tissues is a big tissue category. And nerve tissue is a big tissue category. So on a practical, if they're asking for the big tissue categories, there's only 4 possible answers: epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissue, or nerve tissue. If it asks for the specific tissue name, the specific tissue names are going to be in this column here. So all of these, simple squamous, simple columnar, areolar, reticular, fibrocartilage, blood, cardiac muscle, neuron, all of these are your specific tissue names. Then the structures you're responsible for are going to be found in this column here, the 3rd column. So make sure that you can identify all of these structures on the different tissues underneath the scope. This last column here, the location or where these specific tissues are found, you are not responsible for this column on your practical. That being said, you could see a bonus question from this 4th column here, but you're not responsible for learning it. So again, big tissue category, you only have 4 possible answers: epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissue, or nerve tissue. Now let's talk about the subcategories. Okay, in subcategories, you only have subcategories when you're talking about connective tissues. So connective tissues here will be the only category that have subcategories. You have 3 subcategories. Subcategory number 1 is your connective tissue proper. Subcategory number 2 is your supporting connective tissue. And subcategory number 3 is going to be fluid. Now let me tell you an easy way to know your subcategories. If your tissue ends in the name cartilage or bone, it's going to be supporting subcategory. So again, if your specific tissue is a cartilage or bone, it falls in the subcategory of supporting connective tissue. Your blood here, when you cut yourself, your blood is free flowing, therefore it's a fluid. So the blood here will fit in the subcategory of fluid. Everything else here will fall in the subcategory connective tissue proper. So again, let's go through how to know which subcategory your tissue falls in. Again, if your specific tissue is a cartilage or a bone, it's going to fall into the subcategory of supporting connective tissue. Your blood is free flowing, therefore it is a fluid, so it is going to be in the subcategory of fluid connective tissue. The rest of these will fall into the subcategory of connective tissue proper because they're not supporting and they're not a fluid. Now you may be saying, okay, but I see this one right here, this mesenchyme. Why does mesenchyme not have a subcategory right here? You don't see a subcategory listed. Mesenchyme does not have a subcategory because it is an embryonic connective tissue. So basically it's a baby connective tissue that hasn't grown up into one of these tissues or hasn't developed into one of these tissues yet. So therefore it has not determined which subcategory it's going to grow up into. So mesenchyme is the only connective tissue that does not have a subcategory. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you on the tissue chart. Now let's click over to our connective tissues. Okay, our connective tissues, again, the first note here is remember to be able to identify the subcategories with these, and to remember that there's a rule breaker. In other words, there's one that does not have a subcategory, and that is mesenchyme. So let's start by looking at mesenchyme. You'll see it in the two pictures here. Mesenchyme basically just looks like a bunch of nuclei. There's nothing real descriptive or distinct about it. Again, just a bunch of pink little nuclei floating around here. This is zoomed way in, and you can see, again, just a bunch of pink nuclei looking structures. So on a practical, if I asked you to identify this big tissue category, the big tissue category would be connective tissue. The subcategory, remember, there is no subcategory here because he's an embryonic connective tissue. So there will not be a subcategory asked for this one. If I ask you what the specific tissue is, the specific tissue here is mesenchyme. And there is nothing to identify, no structures that you have to know in this one. Moving along, we now have reticular connective tissue. Reticular connective tissue looks like a bunch of little nuclei with bold blue fibers, or it can also be a bunch of brown-black nuclei with brown-black fibers. So there are two different colors you can see with this. Some people say it also looks like a cherry blossom tree. So you have the little pink dots here would be your cherry blossoms, and the little sticks in here would be the little branches. So on a practical, if you see this underneath the scope and I ask you what is the big tissue category, you would tell me connective tissue. What is the subcategory? Let's see, it's not a cartilage or a bone, so it's not supporting, and it's not free-flowing or blood, so it's not fluid, so therefore it will fall into connective tissue proper. The specific tissue here would be reticular tissue. Structures to identify would be all of these bright blue fibers. Those bright blue fibers are reticular fibers. If it is the other color that I was talking about, it would be the dark brown black fibers. Those would be your reticular fibers. Moving along now, we have the adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat. You can see it kind of looks like little bubbles or cottage cheese. And you'll notice that these nuclei, see them right here where those arrows are pointing, the nuclei are pushed to the outside of the cells. So on a practical, I ask you, what is the big tissue category? You would tell me connective tissue. What is the subcategory? Let's see, it's not a cartilage, it's not bone, therefore it's not a supporting connective tissue. And it's not blood, so it's not fluid, therefore it must be connective tissue proper. The specific tissue would be adipose, and the structures to identify here would be your nuclei. The next tissue is areolar. Areolar is also called loose connective tissue. Some people say it looks like spaghetti and meatballs. I think it looks like spider webs with bugs trapped in it. You have to go with what you can recognize on a practical. So if you see this under a scope and I ask you what the big tissue category is, you would tell me connective tissue. What is the subcategory? The subcategory is connective tissue proper, because it's not a bone or cartilage, therefore it's not a supporting connective tissue, and it's not free-flowing blood, so it's not the fluid connective tissue. Therefore, it must be connective tissue proper. The specific tissue here would be areolar, and there are several structures you need to be able to identify. The elastic fibers, if you look in this one, the elastic fibers are going to be these dark purple black strings in here. Over here, you'll see the elastic fibers running here and here and here. Again, they're the dark blackish purple lines. Then you have the collagen fibers. The collagen fibers are going to be these pink, bold pink lines here. And with this stain, they're going to be the lighter pink lines. The fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are specialized nuclei that produce fibers. So if you see fibers in a microscope slide or on a microscope slide, you know that you do not call that a nucleus, you call it a fibroblast. Again, a fibroblast is a specialized nucleus that produces these fibers. So the fibroblasts in here are all these little bugs or these little dots. So here you see the different fibroblasts. Pictured here is a cartoon illustration of areolar tissue. Make certain that you know this picture for both your quiz, your lab quiz, and your lab practical. The dark strings here, those dark little strings are going to be your elastic fibers. In here, instead of being pink, the collagen fibers are this banded yellow. This little network up here, this is your reticular fibers. Here you will see capillaries with red blood cells in them, here and here. Here, remember from your adipose tissue, you have those cells with the nucleus pushed over to the side. Those cells are actually called adipocytes. So these fat cells here and here are called adipocytes. Then you have lymphocytes or white blood cells. You'll see a white blood cell here, and you'll see a white blood cell here. Then you have a macrophage. Your macrophage here is trapped in this network. And if it's trapped, it's fixed in one position. So this is called a fixed macrophage. This macrophage over here is not trapped in the network, so it's called a free macrophage. This long tubular cell here, this is your fibroblast, and you can see it's kind of attached to these collagen fibers because it's like it's kind of illustrating that it's making or oozing out that collagen fiber. So this would be your fibroblast. This cell here with all these dark granules, this is going to be the mast cell. This darker cell here, this is a melanocyte. These cells are responsible for producing your black-brown pigments. So again, make sure you can label all the parts of this cartoon picture of the areolar tissue. Okay, I'm going to go down in our magnification here because I want you to see both of these together, and then we'll talk about them separately. So the top pictures here is your dense regular. The bottom picture here are your dense irregular connective tissue. The difference between the two is dense regular is flowing in one direction, so it has a regular pattern to it. In here, you'll see there is no pattern. It's all over the place. It's in multiple different directions, so it's called irregular. Both of these are tightly packed with collagen fibers. Being they're tightly packed, it is dense. So now let's go back up to the first one. I'm going to increase our magnification again. Okay, so here we're seeing the dense regular connective tissue. In this one, what you're looking for is the gentle rippling or bubbling of a stream, you know, the light waves you see in a stream. And the little twigs or stones, so like this twig, this twig, this twig, these little stones or twigs floating up on those waves, all of those little twigs or stone looking things are called your fibroblasts. And all of the pink fibers throughout here, all the pink in here, are going to be your collagen fibers. So when you're looking at this under the scope, the big tissue category is going to be connective tissue. The subcategory is connective tissue proper. The specific tissue is dense regular. The structures to identify are the pink, those are your collagen fibers, and then the little sticks or twigs that are floating on top of those little waves are going to be your fibroblasts. Again, you're going to call these fibroblasts and not nuclei because these are the specialized nuclei that produce fibers, and they're called fibroblasts. Moving on to the next one, now we see these two pictures here. These pictures represent your dense irregular connective tissue. A lot of people say they look like a bad hair day because the collagen fibers run in all different directions. So if you have long hair, you walk outside on a very windy day, your hair goes in all different directions. So the only thing to identify in here, there are two. All the pink fibers here are going to be your collagen fibers. And then you'll see these darker dots. Those darker dots are going to be your fibroblasts. And if you look really, really careful in this one, it zoomed way out, you can see little bitty teeny tiny purple dots. Those will be your fibroblasts. And all the pink here and here, all throughout here, are going to be your collagen fibers. The next tissue is elastic tissue. This one is different from your dense regular. Even though it is running in one direction, like your dense regular, these fibers are going to be much smaller or thinner. They're also going to have much smaller fibroblasts, and they're going to have a lot of spaces between these fibers. In our laboratory, ours does not quite look like this. This has a rippling or a wavy effect. In our laboratory, these fibers are very straight. So the big tissue category here would be connective tissue. The subcategory would be connective tissue proper. The specific tissue name would be elastic tissue. And the structures to identify all of these pink fibers here are going to be elastic fibers, not collagen fibers. Here they're elastic fibers. And the purple dots or the black dots, whatever color they look like to you, those dots are going to be your fibroblasts. Make sure on a practical or quiz you label this as elastic tissue because there is an elastic cartilage, and your professor needs to know that you know which one this is, either elastic tissue or elastic cartilage. Okay, the next one is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage have very large lacunae. Those are those big circles right there. And they usually come in baby colors. So you'll see a baby pinkish gray or a baby bluish gray or a light baby purple. Okay. So the big tissue category here is connective tissue. The subcategory is supporting connective tissue. The specific tissue name is hyaline cartilage. When I point to one of these, this little dot in the center, that dot in the center is the cell called the chondrocyte. This little open pocket is a space called a lacunae. And if I'm pointing out here to the middle of nowhere, where you don't see anything, and I ask what this background is called matrix. So again, if I point here and I say, what is this space? I'm asking for lacunae. If I ask, what is this cell? I'm asking for chondrocyte. If I ask what this background is, I'm asking for the matrix. The next one is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage looks like a lava flow. And there on the side, there are stacks and stacks of lacunae with your chondrocytes in them. One note here, a chondrocyte, chondro means cartilage, cyte means cell. So a chondrocyte is simply a cartilage cell. Okay, so again, this is fibrocartilage. It looks like a lava flow. So if you see this on a practical and you're asked what is a big tissue category, the answer is connective tissue. If you're asked the subcategory, this would be supporting connective tissue because it's a fibrocartilage, because it's cartilage. Remember, cartilage and bone falls into the subcategory of supporting connective tissue. This specific tissue is called fibrocartilage. if I point over here where you see these little, look like air bubbles, and I ask you to identify the space is a lacunae. And if I point to those and I ask you to identify the cell is called a chondrocyte. If I point out here to the middle of nowhere, you see there's nothing here, and I ask you what this background is, the background is called the matrix. Okay. Now the elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage has a band in it, so you'll see here, this forms a band, a dark band. So always think of like when women are pregnant, they have to wear those mom jeans with the thick elastic band at the top. So elastic band, elastic cartilage, it's going to be stretchy and flexible. Okay, so you're looking for that dark band, and when you see that dark band, you know that you're looking at elastic cartilage. So if you see this under a scope on your practical and they ask you what is the big tissue category, it is connective tissue. If they ask you what the subcategory is, it is supporting connective tissue. Remember, your cartilages and your bone fall under the subcategory of supporting connective tissue. This specific tissue is elastic cartilage. And if I point to one of these and I ask you what the cell is the chondrocyte. If I point in here and ask you what the space is the lacunae. If I point between those lacunae and I ask you what the background is the matrix. And then if I point in here and ask you what the black line is, it's not labeled on this document, but if I ask you what the black lines are here, the black lines will be the elastic fibers. Then we have bone. Bone is easy to identify. If you chop down a tree and you look into the trunk, you will see tree rings. That's what bone looks like. So if you see the tree rings, you know you're looking at the bone. So the big tissue category here would be connective tissue. The subcategory would be supporting connective tissue, because remember, your cartilages and your bone fall into the subcategory of supporting connective tissue. This specific tissue would be bone. Now let's go through all of the structures you need to identify. I'm going to magnify this so that it's easier to see. Okay, this central area right here and this central area right here, the stains are just a little bit different here. So one, it looks black, the other one, it looks empty. That central area right there is called the central canal. You'll see it labeled on this side, central canal. Then you'll see each of these rings as you go around. So there's one ring, there's another ring, here's another ring, a fourth ring. Each of those rings is a lamellae, labeled on number 1 here. Each of the rings is called a lamellae. Each of these little radiating black lines, these teeny tiny black lines that radiate outward, those are called your caniculi. Caniculi means a very tiny canal. Then you'll see these black bug looking things, those black bugs. The entire thing is an osteocyte in the lacunae. Remember, in cartilages, we had chondrocytes in the lacunae, chondro meaning cartilage, so we can't use that term here. Here we use osteocyte. Osteo means bone, and cyte means cell. So there is a bone cell inside of a little pocket. That pocket or that space is called the lacunae. So if you are asked what this structure is an osteocyte in the lacunae, and you'll see it labeled down here under number 2. See that right there, that little bug shape? That's your osteocyte in the lacunae. But they can also point to this and ask you on number 2 here, they could ask you what this cell is. The cell is an osteocyte. And if they ask you what the space is the lacunae. Now we're looking at blood. Kind of go out here. Okay, in the blood, you're looking for a bunch of these little hot pink cells here, and then you're looking for some cells that have purple nuclei in them. Okay, so that will trigger you to know that this is blood. So if you see this underneath a microscope slide on your practical and you're asked what the big tissue category is, big tissue category here is connective tissue. The subcategory, remember your blood is free flowing, therefore your subcategory is fluid connective tissue. This specific tissue is blood. There are several structures you need to be able to identify. All of these little cells here, these hot pink, light pink to hot pink cells without a nucleus are called your red blood cells. All of these cells here, there's 5 of them pictured in this picture and there's 2 of them here. Those cells with the dark purple nucleus in them, those are your white blood cells. So again, red blood cells, no nucleus. White blood cells have a nucleus, these 2 here, and these 5 right here are your white blood cells. Then if we take this and we blow it up, you will see these teeny tiny purple dots. Those purple dots are your platelets. They're going to be involved in clotting. Then if I point to the middle of nowhere out here and ask you what this background is or what this matrix is, this matrix is called plasma. That's the liquidy part of the blood. And that wraps up our connective tissues.